I'm Ron, V3VN, Victor November, and I've been a ham for a very long time. What can I say? Um, I've given a presentation like this, actually an earlier version of it, to a few of the local clubs, and it seemed to go over fairly well. And I guess that's why I'm here. And I've got to do a couple of things because I live in such a rural location. I've actually come to somebody else's shack. I'm actually in the shack of V3 Charlie Roger George, who you probably know as somebody who operates CW at about 50 words a minute when he gets on the air. So if I start talking fast, that's why. And yeah, there's quite a few people in the webinar right now. Actually, this is a little bit larger than the biggest group I've actually given this presentation to, so that's pretty good. Now, I'm a little bit of a Zoom neophyte. I haven't used it since yesterday. So there's a few things I need to sort out here, but basically you don't really need to look at me. I'm not very interesting. I'm going to try to do this thing about their screen again and see if I can get this going. And you can look at that instead of me, which is a lot more interesting. And just 1 second. If I can get this thing in full screen. Okay. So there we go. So I'll get started here, and if I start going too slow, Adam, you just let me know.
Of course.
Because I don't see a clock on the screen when I do this. So again, I'm Ron V3VN. I live in a fairly isolated rural location in Eastern Ontario. I lived for many years in Ottawa, and originally I'm from Winnipeg. And in fact, I'm just going to start with just a little bit of history. I've been a ham, as you can see, for quite a long time. It's actually frightening to actually think about it. It's been close to 50 years. I got licensed in 1972. At the tender age of, I think I was 15 at the time, which in fact was the minimum age to become a licensee. In V4, I was in Winnipeg. And it's kind of interesting, but I got interested in 6 meters actually very quickly. It had to do a little bit about the licensing structure in Canada at the time. And that was one of the few ways I could actually get on the phone when I had a CW only license, when I had my basic license. And I fell in love with 10 meters and then 6 meters. Started off by borrowing somebody's rig. And then I finally got my own. I started with a little transverter of my ancient FT101 and started having just a great time. I didn't work very much DX at that time because anybody who's been a VE4 knows that's a long way from everywhere else. Being a VE3, a few thousand kilometers away makes a big, big difference. In fact, being on either coast makes a big, big difference. And I did start operating some of the solar maximum in 1979 on 6 meters, but I had very little time. I was very busy with my university work, and I really missed most of it. But after I moved to Ottawa area, I got involved with 6 meters again fairly quickly. It doesn't seem like very long. It was only 6 years after I moved, but at the time it like felt forever. I didn't have my own station. Mostly I did HF contesting, and I will say that contesting is in fact my primary interest in amateur radio. And that was I was doing for I could scrape up enough money and buy a house and put up a tower. And I was there just in time for the solar maximum of 1989, 1990, which was fabulous. It was basically the one of the biggest or highest maximums in recent history. And it worked very well, except for the big problem of being a worker. So I couldn't operate all the time, which kind of put a crimp on things, but that's the way it is. But at that time, I worked DXCC countries, almost no Europe, which is interesting because in that time, 6 meters was not an amateur band in most of the world. So if it had been like today, you might be able to double that number. And I came one V3 question mark away from worked all continents, and that was from Japan for Asia. Now I have retired and I've moved to a rural location, and I've got the same 6 element Yagi up on a tower, although it's been now redesigned using computer optimization software. And it's been a solar minimum. So all my operating is sporadic key and are also combination with trans-equatorial. And that's to get into the southern hemisphere. And I'll talk more about that as I go on. I probably said a little bit too much about my history. But let's talk a little bit more generally. Why do hams now start moving to 6 meters? And I'll tell you that activity on 6 meters has just growing like gangbusters. It's just wonderful. Yes, there's more QRM, but I welcome the QRM to see all that activity. I really love seeing. One of the reasons is, of course, we are in a minimum. And working DX and HF with small stations can be difficult. 6 meters is another opportunity. During the mid-summer peaks, DXing is very possible. At other times, you can work a little bit more locally, but it's a lot of fun. The other thing is, of course, every modern transceiver has 6 meters. And everybody says, well, what happens when I turn the band switch to that little 6 and see what happens? So a lot of people are attracted to it by the fact of buying the equipment. High performance antennas are very small. You could set up a 2 or 3 element Yagi on your dining room table. Now, I don't recommend that. Your family might object, but you can do it. And I've operated, as you can see, a little QRP rig on the patio deck, which I did when I had my station in Ottawa. I don't have to do that anymore, but it was very, very handy. So it's very easy to get on 6 meters. The propagation is interesting. Like, why do they call it the magic band? And the reason is that every propagation mechanism you can think of is there. You want F-layer propagation, as you see on HF. Yes, I mean, obviously not very much. It kind of peters out by the time you get to 6 meters, but it does have. I saw very little of it in the last solar maximum. There was very, very little, but it's there. Usually when it's we have a weak cycle like the last one and also likely the upcoming one, it's mostly north-south, but that means South America, which is not bad. And when it's during the maxima, it can be very, very good. But it's very frustrating, and one of the things is that it makes it very, very challenging. It attracts people who like a challenge, people who have done everything, and of course, many of us have grown older. Contesters, DXers, if you worked every country in the world, what do you do next? You look for the next challenge. Some people go to one, some people try to do great things in contests, or you go up to VHF and try to contest. In addition to the modes that we've been talking about, there is also tropospheric propagation, which is quite good on 6 meters. You can get out to about 1,000 kilometers with a good system. And of course, you have everything else. You got Earth Moon, you got equatorial, as I mentioned, meteor scatter, and other types of scatter. And in fact, that little spectrogram you see there is a different kind of scatter. And I'm going to leave that as a puzzle for now. I'll come back to it later. But you can try to guess what you're actually looking at there. That is not somebody's transmitter going. Now, when I talk about DXing, I should actually specify what I mean by DX. It means something different to everyone. So I can only tell you what it means to me. And to me, it's everything beyond a single E-layer skip, which is, let's say, about 2,000 kilometers. If you're that, I'm interested. If you're in a different country, I'm interested as well. Other people like chasing grids. And of course, you find if it's a different country, if you go on 6 meters and you call CQDX, you'll get a lot of Americans answering because to you, you're a DX, you're in another country. So you have to sometimes be a little bit more specific, like calling CQ Europe. But that's what it is for me. And that circle is important because getting beyond that circle is where the challenge really begins. So let's understand a little bit about sporadic key because that is the primary mode at all times for working DX on 6 meters. We're working almost anything on 6 meters. The other modes are a little bit more episodic. Peaks at the summer solstice. I don't mean July, I mean not the height of summer, but at the actual solstice right near the end of June. For reasons that are becoming increasingly, but not perfectly. There is a much smaller peak at the winter solstice. Now, I'm also mentioning this with respect to the kind of latitudes that most of us live in. If you're a VE8 or a VY0, you're going to see very differently. And if you're down in the Caribbean, again, it's going to be very different. But let's talk about what it is we're going to experience. That's what matters to us. So when we talk about it being sporadic, unpredictable, that's true, but the physics is becoming increasingly well understood. It's not my purpose here to tell you what it is, but to tell you about what it means and how we make use of it. So the predictability is poor, and that's why it's called sporadic. I don't know when it's going to open. I've had people ask me, well, what time of day should I get on to work Europe? And the answer is, well, really no. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't understand it. For example, we understand rain, but if you ask me if it's going to rain at 2 p.m. on Monday, well, I may get it right or I may get it wrong. And predicting sporadic key is not as good as predicting the weather, but we're getting better. It is getting better. Now, in addition to the annual cycle, most importantly is what happens during the day. And one of the things to understand is a thing called spotlight propagation, is that the E-layer patches off which you reflect and refract signals tend to be incredibly tiny. You wouldn't realize it, but if you take a look at that map in the lower right-hand corner, you'll get an idea by looking at the actual active QSOs in a particular 6 meter. And notice that all the lines cross, so you know where the patches of ionization actually are. Sometimes they could be as small as just a few square kilometers somewhere up in the ionosphere. They can be smaller, larger. The larger they are, the more widespread the open, and usually the stronger the signals. And the smaller ones can be very challenging. There's also daily variation. For example, if you look at the bottom, I drew you a chart to show when it opens from my QTH, which is going to, of course, be different across the country, but from my QTH to Japan. And notice that the sun is at the exact center of the path. It's about 2 hours before our sunset, about 2200 Zulu, and about 2 hours after sunrise in Japan. And that's true of many of the more distant, longer path openings. And those are, of course, multi-hop, or it might be core-hop in some cases, like from cloud to cloud. And so that's one of the reasons why some of the more challenging paths only open right at the maximum. And you won't often see them at other times of the year. North-south is different because then we get into the interaction with TEP. If there's a TEP cloud somewhere in the middle, well, you can work South America during the winter because, of course, it's the peak of sporadic key season down in South America. That's their summer. So never forget that. You can also work DX when they're having their peak season if you get TEP in the middle. And also about daily, there is a daily cycle as well, but I find it less predictable. But some people have charted, as I show in the upper right-hand corner. And you can try to use that if you will. I find it a little bit unreliable, but sometimes it works for people depending where you're located. Now, I want to talk a little bit. I haven't said anything about FT8 yet, and there's a reason for it, is that 6 meter DXing has been there for a long time, but it's very elusive. One of the big problems with modes like CW is in order to find an opening, you have to keep twirling the VFO, or back in the old days, we used to put our rigs on scan mode when they finally had some digital electronics in them back in the 80s and 90s. And but that's very difficult. Sometimes you just have to get lucky. Just tune across the station at the right time, and by the time you finish the QSO, the band just drops out and they're gone. And there's no point in even letting your friends know. So one of the things about FT8 is that it works incredibly well, which is actually kind of surprising. Like, I am a primarily like 95% CW operator. That's my favorite mode. It took a little bit to get me to switch to digital, not because I have any philosophical problem with it, and my background is very technical, so I love the stuff. I mean, I've even written DSP software, so the stuff that they do, getting into the under the hood of WSJTX and all the digital modes, I love that. It's very, very fascinating to me, and I've read a lot of the technical information on how it actually works. But as an operating mode, it doesn't excite me too much. Quite honestly, watching the computer do the decoding doesn't mean much to me. But the problem is that, well, one is that when everybody made the migration, it happened incredibly fast. When I got back in the air for my new QTH at the end of 2016, I really only got into 6 meters in 2017, around June 2017. I finally got my 6 meter antenna back up. And very quickly, I jumped right into the middle of that migration. Suddenly, everybody moved to FT8, and I had very few people left to work on CW and sideband. And then in 2018, as soon as the season started up, the acceleration, the migration was just phenomenal. By the end of the 2018 sporadic E season, in August, CW and sideband was a wasteland. There was nobody there. So if you like making QSOs, of course, you have to go where everybody is. So you can persist and say you're going to operate CW or sideband, but if you got nobody to talk to, what's the point? Now, the reason there, of course, everybody went to FT8 is they found that it actually accelerated the results. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Now, why is it so great for 6 meter DXing? Why does FT8 work so well? It isn't really obvious. If you take a look at these are my actual country numbers from the past several years of operating, starting from 0. I'm not somebody who kind of counts my countries from 72. I don't care about that. I like measuring how I'm doing now, not how I did in the past. So when I got back on the air on 6 meters in 2016, I started counting, and I was doing CW and sideband. After the seasons, I was up to 36, which is not bad, considering it's all sporadic E. But it kind of like petered out then, as I mentioned, everybody started going to FT8. And when I started on FT8, in the very first summer, like within 3 months, I had 56 countries. Now, when you consider the speed of an FT8 QSO, which is, generally speaking, about 10 times as long as a CW QSO, and that's the very basic minimum, exchanging call signs, reports, like see you later 73, which is what a lot of people are doing when they're DXing. It's really, really slow.
Oh, looks like we may have had an issue with connection there. Apologies to everyone. Just give me 1 second. We're going to see if we can get Ron back. Just apologies to all. We will just try to get him connected back to the webinar, and then we can carry on from where we left off.
I obviously got disconnected there for a while.
You did. It looks like you only dropped off about 25 seconds ago. So you may want to just open up your screen sharing again and go back 1 slide, and that should be fine.
Okay, let me do that. What's it doing here? Okay, I'm back in there. Now, I've been neglecting. Oh, there's an opinion about antennas. Let me come back to that one later and just continue with the presentation. Sorry, I have to get used to using all these windows. So if I don't see your questions, it's not because I'm ignoring you, because I haven't figured this stuff out. Now, okay, you said I should probably go back to, whoops, what's going on here? I talked about migration.
Yes, you did talk about all of that.
Okay, so let me move on then. I started talking about the countries,
Mhm.
and I think I talked about really. I think the only thing that I probably missed off was one of the key advantages of FT8. Sometimes I call it the discovery problem, is that you can see all the activity at once. Everybody's in the same watering hole at 50.313, and there's also 50.3.323 that's reserved for intercontinental DX. And it's wonderful that way because if somebody shows up, and those openings can be very, very brief, is you'll see it immediately just out of the corner of your eye and you just jump on it. And that makes the difference. So that first year, 56 countries. The second year in 2019, I kind of jumped up to like 71. You notice that most of the year, the number doesn't change because the season, the DXing season, is May, June, July, a little bit on the shoulder months of April and August. But outside of that, there isn't much. And in fact, most of the year, I have my 6 meter antenna disconnected. And then in 2020, I had another very good year. I got up to 90 countries, so just shy of DXEC. And I finally worked all continents. And my final continent at this time, Japan, it was actually Oceania when I worked at KH6. So that was actually kind of interesting. So finally got into that. As 2021 comes around, I fully expect to reach that magic 100 and maybe even extend quite a bit. Let me talk a little bit about 2020. Like 2020 has been a very fascinating year, not just for me. There have been tremendous openings right across the country, from VE1 right across to VE7. I'm not sure about the north because I don't know of any regular 6 meter operators in the far north. There are some beacon stations like in Nunavut, like VY0 SNO, which is actually very interesting for catching those polar openings. But for all of us, it's been a very good year. You know, it's amazing when I heard, actually, I was actually monitoring VE7 stations this year, working Europe over the pole, which is just fascinating. You know, for them, it must be at least as difficult as it is for me to work Japan. And this year, Japan was amazing. In southern Ontario this year, in late, they had a tremendous opening to the Far East. But although that was the dividing line was only about 300 kilometers away from me, and here, nothing, absolutely nothing. I also checked with friends a little bit to the east of me, you know, partway between here and Toronto, and again, nothing. By the time you got to Toronto, the band was wide open. Work in Japan, and then it opened up to Korea, China, the Philippines, and here nothing. But on July 11th, we had probably the best sporadic opening for DX that I've ever seen, for me, that I've experienced. On that day, I worked 30 Japanese stations, 60 Europeans. And when it opened, it was the same day as for contesters will know the IARU radio sport. And I was down on CW on 10 meters working a ton of Europeans because the maximum usable frequency dropped below 50 megahertz, but 10 meters was wide open. So that was great. I've also, if you read Dana's column in TCA, you would have seen that there was a ZL actually copied of VE3, which is, if you think about it, is amazing. So that was in their winter and our summer. And that's getting pretty close to around the world, which is pretty amazing. Central Asia, I got up one morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, and my eyes just about popped out of my head. I was copying UNs. That's Kazakhstan. Well, imagine that. I mean, I hardly ever hear the Middle East. And here I am looking at these strong stations from Central Asia. Unfortunately, it was only for a few minutes and I didn't quite make the grade, but that was just fascinating. I've had times when I've had three continents coming through at the same time. As you'll notice, like the on the right, giving you an idea what it looks like in terms of a really busy European opening from here. I got tons of stations calling me. Another time, and unfortunately, there aren't too many hams in Africa, But this was the time when in chat, TT8SN, I took a little sample here, but for 30 minutes straight, he was calling CQ with not a single caller. There was the spotlight between me and chat, if you would believe it, and nobody else was hearing him. But I had already worked them like a week before that, so I left them alone. But sometimes they don't leave you alone. I remember
Oh, apologies again. It looks like we do have some connection issues. Hopefully Ron will be back very shortly.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. It looks like you just had a bit of a brief interruption, but you were not disconnected.
Oh, okay, good. So I'll just continue on then, because I can tell when my video freezes that gone wrong. So let me just go back here where I was. So I'll talk about the European opening. It shows you how good it can be. I was mentioning at the 6W1TA, and after working him the next week, he was calling CQ, getting no answers, and I kind of left him alone, and then he ended up calling me because he wanted to work somebody. But other times, it can be very frustrating. If you take a look at the program on the bottom, is you'll notice that all the even intervals are empty. That's everybody else working DX and me hearing nothing. So for me, the band was dead to DX, but I could hear all the other Canadians and Americans working stuff that I could not hear. And that happens a lot of the time, and all I can say is your day will come. Let me just talk a little bit about Japan. This was the one that I missed back in 1989, 1990, and it was very frustrating. In 2018, in Japan, it was actually quite a good opening from here, and that's my screen. But you'll notice that I'm not on there because I wasn't in the shack and I missed it. It lasted about 15 minutes and I wasn't there. So I came back in the shack and I saw exactly what I missed. So that was kind of unfortunate, but that happens all the time. You can't be sitting in front of the radio 24/7. In 2019, it got an interesting opening. I worked 4 Japanese stations and I was incredibly happy. And it was one of those openings, again, it was a spotlight where it seemed like nobody else was here in Japan except me. And that's, again, what happens. And then in 2020, incredible things happen. That spectrogram you see on there, every single thing that you're looking at there is from Japan. Every single one. What you're not seeing is the intervals where I'm transmitting. Of course, WSJTX edits those out. So you only see my receive. And it's not often you see a screen that looks like that. And it's quite amazing. So when the magic happens on 6 meters, it really is magical. When you think about this, I couldn't do that during, solar maximum peak F layer. I've worked far more DX or better DX on sporadic keys than I ever did by F layer. So who cares about solar maximums? Waiting for nothing. Get on now.
Now that we've seen what it is you can actually do with DXing on 6 meters FT8, let's talk a little bit about what it takes to be successful. There's a lot of little tips and tricks that you can actually follow to make your success greater than it would be otherwise. And those are quite interesting. There's a lot about FT8 itself that I'm not going to be covering, but there's a lot of online resources if you've never done digital. So I'm just going to talk specifically about DXing on 6 meters. The first thing is about timing. Now, one of them is very common to all the digital modes. The mode is FT8 and the others are not synchronous, but you still need to have the clocks very closely tied together and synchronized. And one of the best things that you can do is look at that DT column in WSJTX. If everybody's clock appears to be off, it's probably you, and you need to do something about your time. The best thing to do is use an external service. There are quite a few of them available. I'm currently using one called NetTime. It works in the background and makes sure your clock is right on the millisecond, and you really never have to worry about it again. That's the best thing to do. So that's the first thing, is your clock. The other thing is you have to coordinate with people elsewhere in the world. And the UK 6 meter group has come up with a protocol that everyone is pretty well following now, that on the western end of a circuit, you use the odd intervals or the second intervals. They usually go by different names, but it's on the 15 and 45 second after the minute. And on the eastern side, you use 0 and 30. So, for example, when you're trying to work Europe, make sure that you're on the 15 and 45 interval for transmit, and they'll be on the other interval. And you want to get that right, because first off, if you go on the other interval, you're going to miss a lot of people. And the other thing is, of course, you're transmitting when everybody's listening to Europe, and they're not going to appreciate the QRM. So it's very important to get this right. Now, I will point out that not everybody follows this, but it's followed pretty well. Even going across to the Pacific, to Japan, and to the Pacific, it's a little bit less rigid when it comes to the southern hemisphere, working north-south. For us to South America, the Caribbean, and also to Africa, and it's a little bit random. You'll just have to kind of play it by ear to see what other people are doing. Some people will call CQ on even intervals and try it on the odd intervals and kind of flip back and forth. But keep that in mind. So on the next slide, the other thing here is about speed. Again, keeping this idea of the clock is that because the paths are so open or so short, especially in the longer the path, is that you have to move quickly. Don't wait, call immediately. You see a station, call them. Doesn't really matter what you do, just call them. The openings may be less than 60 seconds. If you're not there, then you're not going to work them. And keeping it with that is what everybody sees all the time. You'll get this what we call the agony of the single decode, as I show here, where you see one message from a station and that's it. That's how brief the openings can be sometimes. It's almost like meteor scatter in the briefness. And that's just the nature of sporadic key on those very long paths. You're relying on an alignment quite often of multiple ionization patches in the E layer, and the connection between them, it has to be just right. And sometimes it just comes up for just a few seconds and it's gone. So ways to actually work them faster. One of them is to skip the grid, and you can disable standard message number 1, where you call them using your grid square, and you can just drop that. There is actually no need for a valid QSO to actually exchange grid square. A valid QSO is the exchange of call signs and signal reports and the confirmation of both. It's the same as if you're on CW or sideband. You don't need to send a grid square. That's really just a convenience for you, and it's very interesting, but it's not particularly necessary. The other thing that you can do to go faster is using the RR73 message. And that way, what you're really saying is, okay, we're done, you're in the log, and see you later. But if the other station doesn't receive the RR73, they're probably going to come back, you'll have to send it again. And some people, even when they send RR73, if you don't send a 73 in return, they may not log you. And this is one of the big dilemmas with the digital nodes. It's very difficult to know when the QSO is complete, and you're always left a little bit guessing as to whether or not they're in the log. Some people will log even what is not necessarily a legitimate QSO. They haven't gotten that final RR, and you just have to be a little bit careful about it. But the RR73 is used pretty universally now on 6 meter FT8 to speed up the QSOs for DXing. But you have to be aware of some of the downfalls. Now on the next slide, another thing you can do is monitor the intercontinental window for FT8, which is up another 10 kilohertz at 50.323 megahertz. It is not used extensively, So I would say don't monitor 323 first, monitor 313. What will happen is if the opening starts getting good, a lot of people will move to 323, especially if there's a lot of domestic opening. For example, when it's open to Europe, it may be open to Florida from here. And that will really fill up the spectrogram and the band, and it gets pretty busy and there's lots of QRM. That might be a good time to check out 323. And that's a good thing. But a lot of people won't go there just because they don't see as many stations. So you just have to kind of play it by ear. Sometimes it helps us to go over to 323 and call CQ occasionally, see what happens. And if it doesn't, well, go back to 313. And the adoption of 323 has been very uneven, and there's no particular reason for it. We're just peculiar creatures of habit, and we get kind of used to being on 313 and nailing our VFOs there. But try to be a little bit flexible. You might even want to try FT4 on 50.318. Sometimes people will show up there. So on the next slide, a few things to keep in mind here. Like when there's a DX opening, the DX will get a lot of attention, and quite honestly, if you're heard in Europe, you may get a lot of attention yourself. As I showed before, it's quite common to get pileups of DX stations, because to them, you're also DX. So keep that in mind. But let's just say, here's an example. Somebody is on 1950 audio offset, and they're calling CQNA. Now notice that I show a sample of stations calling and I return, but the question here is, where do you actually call? There are basically three choices. You can call them at a lower audio offset, a higher audio offset, or on their transmit frequency. Now, one of the ways to understand what's actually happening is that all the FT8 programs, and of course includes WSJTX, they do multiple passes of the spectrum in decoding signals. Usually they'll go from bottom to top, find all the strongest signals, decode those in order from lowest frequency to highest frequency. Then those signals will be subtracted from the spectrum, and it'll do a second pass, and it'll find signals buried underneath. Is actually one of the most amazing things about these digital modes, is that it's possible to decode multiple layers of signals, 2 and 3 deep, on the very same audio frequency. And then you get a second pass. And if you go really aggressive, you can actually turn on a third pass. And if you go through the WSJTX options, you'll find that. And you can find some particularly weak signals. But the important thing is to watch the decode window on the left on WSJTX. And there's a sample shown on the left of this slide that was actually taken off the air. Notice how the numbers start at the bottom, they go up to the top, and suddenly they start again at the bottom. And that's the second pass. And when that happens, you will notice that some of those signals actually overlap those in the first pass, so you can tell what is actually going on there. Now, the important thing is that if you turn on call first, when you're calling CQ and people are calling you, is it takes the first signal in the decode list. So ideally, you want to be the one that's lowest frequency picked up on the first pass, and you will be automatically picked up by WSJTX. Many stations will ignore that and will pick the station they're going to call, although you have to be very quick about that because you only have a couple of seconds before your signal is going to be a little bit too late and not be decoded, which can slow things down. But keep that in mind when you're calling. Sometimes you'll see stations crowding at the low end of all the audio frequencies. That'll cause QRM, so it doesn't always work, but keep that in mind. Now, when you're one thing that's been a big controversy, if you go back decades, is the idea of tail-ending a DX station. And that is where they're in the final transmission to the station that they're currently working, and you want to work them. And tail-ending is sometimes seen as a good thing to do, sometimes it's seen as discourteous. But in FT8, it can be very courteous. And what you do there is you call them at the same time the other station would be sending their final QSO message. So notice that in that window I'm calling DM9ZZZ at the same time that they're getting the 73 message from that American station that they just worked. Now, of course, I don't actually see the 73 message because I'm transmitting at the same time, but I saw the German stations RR73, which means that they were done. So I call back. And if they receive the 73 from the other station and they get my message, then they're automatically going to come back to me. They don't even have to touch the mouse. It's just going to respond directly to me. And that can be a big time saver and get you in there faster rather than later. So think about that. Now, if you are going to do that, one important thing with tail ending, and actually it's a good idea in general, don't call the DX station on their transmit frequency. It doesn't give you any advantage. It can be a disadvantage because a lot of people will call on that frequency, and that means there's going to be a layer of QRM when they try to decode signals. And of course, when you're tail ending, it's a matter of courtesy. Don't go on top of the other station. Pick a different frequency, as I've shown here. The other thing about call first, if you do use it and you use very deep decoding, especially the third layer, be very careful because the decoding algorithm makes mistakes. There's no certainty in the decoding, and sometimes it will decode noise as being a message, as I kind of show in the bottom here. And the software can be very liberal in terms of what kind of noise it interprets as being your call. And it's not unusual to hear people responding to noise, which is obviously a nonsense call. Like notice the very low signal to noise ratio right at the very limit of FT8, and the very strange time offset. That's pretty well a guarantee that it's noise. So on the next slide, there are some operating aids that can make your life a lot easier. I remember back in the old days of 6 meters when we didn't have online chats and a lot of other things, we used to coordinate on 10 meters. There was a frequency where everybody coordinated because, of course, the maximum usable frequency of the muff always reached 10 meters before it reached 6 meters. So it was a great place to coordinate. If you can't coordinate on 10, you're certainly not going to work on 6. Now, the first thing is that there are a range of beacons. Most of them are in the range of 50 to 50.08 megahertz, just below where most of the CW activity is on the band. So watch for those beacons if you don't hear anything else. And also the other thing to do is, of course, listen to the 10-meter beacons, which I think are around 28.2. And if you'll hear those beacons, of course, that's also a pretty good sign. Or if the band, you start hearing Europeans on 10 meters, that's also a very good sign. A lot of people are surprised at a solar minimum to hear DX stations on 10 meters, but sporadic key is not limited to VHF. It's there on HF as well, just that most people don't realize that it's sporadic key. Also listen to the big guns in your region. Know who they are, because when they're starting to work DX, and that means that your time may be coming up in a few minutes, because they're going to hear stations before you do. They're going to be heard before you do. So if they're working stuff, pay attention. Another good thing to use is PSK Reporter, and that's really a wonderful thing. You can also just turn it on in WSGTX so that you become a listening station for PSK Reporter. It's the simplest thing in the world. There's just one little box that you tick. But with it, if you sit there and calling CQ or you're just active on the band and you monitor the map, it will show you everybody who's on 6 meters FT8 if you set your filters accordingly. And it will flag, and people will talk about flags on the air all the time. This is what they're referring to, PSK Reporter. If you get a flag in Europe, you can see what stations have been hearing you in the background. They might not be calling you, but they may have their stations on and monitoring, of course, as you are. And you'll find out where you're being heard. And that can be very useful feedback, even if you're not actually working anywhere. Especially for the big guns, they use that a lot because they can really monitor what's actually happening on the band. The other thing that you can do is use DX clusters, the spotting networks. They're quite good because you can't always be in your shack all the time looking at the screen and monitoring it all the time. So just carry it around with you on your smartphone. I do that. Keep alerts on with a 6-meter filter so that only 6-meter spots show up. If you see, say in my case, VE3s or W1s, spotting some Europeans or South Americans, then you want to get on there and run back to the shack. Other thing you can do is get on the chat. It's used quite extensively by the people that are very active on 6 meters, and that's ON4KST. Just take a look on the web and you'll find that, and that can be very useful. It's also useful for coordinating QSOs, and I've done that a number of times, not just on FT8 but also on CW and sideband. You're a DX station, so I think I saw your signal, and you might get a direct call. They'll try a little bit harder, turn their beam maybe a few degrees to be a little bit more in your direction, and that can also make the QSO happen. I've done that actually quite successfully. And as I mentioned, always be monitoring. So make sure that even if you're not in the shack, it's no big deal to just leave WSJTX running and monitoring. Every now and then you can pop in the shack, take a look at the screen, see if there's anything interesting. And of course, the last thing is the buddy system. That if you hear something, let your buddies know. I have a number of friends who are also active on 6 meters. Nobody can be in the shack all the time. Sometimes, we'll send a text message or an email or something else. Sometimes actually make a real phone call and just let them know that the band appears to be open. So next slide. Another thing, we talk about putting out a really nice clean signal, but it's not just about being courteous, it's also a matter of being successful. Because if you put out a distorted signal, if you're transmitting a dirty signal, you're going to have problems. Because the thing is that the DX station can't decode your signal, you're not going to make a QSO. And at the same time, your reputation is going to suffer because everybody can see you on the spectrogram. If you have a dirty signal, everybody knows it because they decode your main signal, they see all the noise, and that's a big problem. Now, there are a number of ways to tune up your transmitter. I'm not going to go through all the important things that you need to know, but there are a few things to keep in mind. One is remove all sources of nonlinearity in the transmit path. That means, since a lot of people are using single sideband mode on the transceivers, turn off the processor, turn off the equalizers, unplug your microphone so you don't get noise in the shack coming through. You'd be surprised how often that happens. Another thing to do is, because all our rigs do have harmonic distortion in the transmit chain, there's something called the rule of 1500 that guarantees that your harmonics, audio harmonics, always fall outside the RF passband of 3000 hertz. You can also get around this problem by using in WSJTX split mode, whether it's real split mode or fake split mode, and you can read the documentation to learn about that. And what it does when you go into transmit, it actually changes your transmit frequency so that your harmonics are outside the receive passband of the listening stations. If those actually occur, it actually shifts your transmit bandpass. So that can be very useful. Another thing to watch is your peak envelope pulse, not your average power. FT8 is not CW. So if you have a 100 watt transmitter, you should not be transmitting at 100 watts on your power meter. Peak envelope pulse is the thing to guide by, so you're probably not going to get any more than 70 to 80 watts. That's clean power. And our automatic load controls, ALCs in your transmitter, usually keep things under control, but not always. And if you use an external amplifier, this is critical because usually our amplifiers are not communicating with ALC or any other means to control the transmit power. So it's very, very easy to overdrive a linear amplifier if you turn up the power too hard. It will look as if everything looks clean on your end because you can't really monitor it directly. but you're going to be causing lots of problems. One of the best ways to get rid of these problems is to have a buddy monitor your signal, adjust your transmitter, let them tell you everything's great, give you a thumbs up, maybe send you back a spectrogram. Here are a few examples. The dirty signals on this page are A and C. A is kind of an example of what may be phase noise coming out of a transmitter. So there may be some dirtiness somewhere in the VFO or application chain. It's kind of hard to tell. Whereas C is an obvious example of overdriving, of clipping. They may have a processor on or something else is going on. They may be overdriving an amplifier. Whereas B and D may appear at first glance to be dirty signals or in fact clean signals. B is simply an example that's really an artifact of the fast Fourier transform on the spectrogram, and what's called, for us in the business, FT leakage, where signal energy will show up in adjacent bins, even if it's contained within the actual 42, 50 hertz bandwidth of an FT8 signal. And you'll see that with very strong signals. And that doesn't mean that the signal is dirty. The other thing is D, and I kind of showed you a picture of this before, what is airplane scatter, and you'll get that quite often. And because of the speed of airplanes, which is about, say, 1,000 kilometers per hour, is if you do the arithmetic, you'll find that the offset of those signals, if an aircraft is moving directly away or towards you as aircraft scatter, the offset is about 50 hertz. So when you see those signals on either side of sometimes a strong, even sometimes a weak signal, especially if they're not too distant, if they're domestic signals, you'll see those things. And it's not a sign of distortion. So you won't be surprised when you see that. So on the next slide, your receiver also needs adjustment. And this is, of course, saying that if you can't decode DX, you can't work them. You have to be able to hear them, decode them cleanly. So you need to make sure your receive chain is working as well as it can. Now, one of the things that you have to keep in mind with a receiver, we kind of don't really think about it too much, but the dynamic range of your receiver is enormous. If you look at, say, the minimum discernible signal of a VHF band, it's going to be well below minus 140 dBm. That's decibels below a milliwatt. S9 is nominally minus 73 dBm. Of course, plus 30 dB is minus 40 dBm. So you're looking at a minimum typical range of signals coming into a receiver of over 100 decibels. And I'll tell you right now, you cannot fit 100 decibels into your PC. It will not fit through the sound card. It does not have the dynamic range. Depending on a variety of things, the actual sound card chips, the ADC chips that you're using, and your power supply, especially the power supply, you may be getting as little as 65 dB maximum dynamic range. Even in the best cases, you're probably not going to get any better than 80 decibels. And that's at usually the very good end. And that's typical of your PCs. So the thing is, leave your automatic gain control on, because that'll keep everything kind of fitting. And watch that green bar in WSJ-DX. Don't let it sit down too far. You want it a little bit higher, and there are reasons for doing that that have to do with quantization errors in your ADC. So don't keep it so high that it flashes into the red. Keep it relatively high, and let the AGC on. Let it do what it's supposed to do. If you are having difficulty controlling the audio level, the best thing to do is control the gain by some other means. It's going to vary with your receiver. In my case, I use the RF gain control, and that usually allows me to fine-tune the audio level to get it working, because I'm not actually using the front headphone jack for the PC connection. I use a separate constant volume output on the back of the rig, and that's what a lot of us do. Now, as far as the getting rid of noise and things like that, the important thing here is let the software do the heavy lifting. The digital filters are better than anything you can do with the buttons on the radio. So as with transmit, keep the receiver chain linear. Turn off all the processing. No noise blanker, no noise reduction. Keep the filter flat and wide open, and just let it all into the sound card. And that way the digital filters that the software uses has all the information it needs. The spectrogram at the bottom is not somebody splattering across the band. That's done with a noise blanker that I was using on CW a few minutes before. I had forgotten to turn it off, and I had some impulse noise in the area, and you can see what it does to the spectrogram. And of course the software has to figure all that stuff out, and it's creating nonlinearities, which is going to cause a problem. The other thing about the receiver level is that 6 meters is VHF. That means the environmental noise typically is low. Yes, you may be in an urban setting where there's a lot of man-made noise, but the natural noise is extremely low. And you want to make sure that the antenna noise is overriding your receiver noise. You may have to really turn on that preamp to its maximum on a lot of HF rigs that have 6 meters to get the gain that you need on the front end. And you will need to play with that and get that as high as you can. Once you can start hearing man-made noise, it's probably too high, or at least it's not helping you anymore, and you can turn it down a bit. So on the next slide, now let's talk a little bit about power and effectiveness. And I say this quite often, is that a lot of people have it in their mind that FT8 is a weak signal mode, it's a low power mode, and that's not true. FT8 is a mode like any other mode. It's like CW, sideband, RTTY, FM, you name it. More power is always better. Yes, you can do really well with low power, but you can do that with CW, and a lot of people are using kilowatt amplifiers on CW because it works. And the same is true on FT8. As I show you in the upper right, I was trying to make a QSO with a station in Israel, and that person I know is running a kilowatt amplifier, maybe even a little bit more than a kilowatt, and I am running 100 watts, and I am not making it through. I got received the first time, and not after that. And there's a number of things going on there. You might say that, well, between 100 and 1,000 watts is only 10 dB, but you also don't know what noise the other station has. So their environmental noise could be quite high. I live in a quiet rural location. A lot of people live in very noisy urban locations. And your power is part of being heard on the other end. So you want to be linear, clean, but you also want to be strong. Part of that is power. Part of that is your antenna. If you have more and more antenna gain, you're going to do well, because these openings are fleeting. And what I kind of show here, this very arbitrary scale diagram at the center bottom, is that if you have, say, a very small antenna, you may be at A, and the signal as it comes up, it may never actually be received by a person with A's capability. If you have, say, a better antenna, somebody with B's capability, you have approximately 1 minute, where all those vertical bars are representing a 15-second interval in FT8. So there's just about enough in there to make a QSO, about 1 minute. Whereas if you have even bigger antennas, you may be C, D, or E. Now you're starting to get into big gun territory, and those weak signals, suddenly you have a lot more opportunity to work these stations. They're going to be stronger, and the opening is going to be longer. So having power, having big antennas makes a difference. Of course, it also has disadvantages. On the lower left is an elevation pattern of my antenna, 6 elements at 24 meters height. One of the big problems with these antennas is the major lobe gets chopped up because of ground reflections, and you'll get a number of nulls in the pattern. Because of those reflections, that's the interference pattern with the reflection from the ground. And if the signal is coming in at one of those nulls, then I'm going to be out of luck. You'll find a lot of the big gun stations, they have more than one antenna. They might be individually selectable, or they may be in a stack. And power does make a difference, as I'm showing here on the left. This is an actual screen capture of WSJTX of a German station working me. He had been trying to call a couple of other stations in this particular area, and he was unable to get through. I have the slightly better station, not running much more power than the two other stations whose call signs I have kindly blanked out, just so I'm not really saying who they actually are. They probably might recognize themselves if they're on the webinar, but I work them. And one of the interesting things about this, he sent this to me afterwards, is why I have it, and he thanked me for being his first Canadian station. He's never worked a Canadian station on 6 meters. So remember, those DX guys, they want to work you as much as you want to work them. And I'm always pleased when something like that happens. It's happened a number of times. People have thanked me for being the first Canadian station. So moving on to the next slide. So what actually is the ideal 6 meter station? And it's a matter of, here I'm showing power, having big antennas, and this is one of the big guns on the American northeast coast. What he's got there, I'm kind of showing. It doesn't show up very clearly in the slide, but he's got 2 towers with 4 stacks of 6 meter antennas, and this is the guy who opens up the band all the time. That was actually taken from his QRZ page. That's K1TOL. Off in Maine. Big signal, and he's been on the band for decades. The other thing to do is VHF feed line losses can be very high, so you want big coax. And that's actually a picture of something that's actually in my shack that I was planning to use for VHF. That's a pretty big coax. The other thing is having enough time, and I hate to say this, but one of the best ways to be successful on 6 meters because of the sporadic nature of propagation is to be retired. Being retired is probably one of the best things you can do to improve your DXCC totals on 6 meters. Sad to say. But a lot of us are a little bit older in years, so maybe that's not so terrible. The other thing is to have a nice quiet location. This is a Google satellite view of a part of my property. I have 50 acres in Fox Norway 24 in eastern Ontario, and I'm a long way from everybody else. It's a little bit isolated, but for radio work, it's absolutely wonderful. So just getting towards the closing off of the presentation is that remember that FT8 is not a universal solution. A lot of people don't like digital, and that's fine. But even if you love digital, it doesn't always work. Although there are other digital work modes that can work. For example, for meteor scatter, you want to use something like MSK144, which is really designed for that particular mode, because the meteor pings are too short for FT8. So for that, you want to try other windows where everybody congregates, like 50.260 and the surrounding frequencies. Another thing that's really bad for FT8 is any sort of ionospheric distortion, such as aurora and polar flutter. And you can see a spectrogram there, what happens when aurora gets a hold of a signal on FT8. And that can never be decoded. It will never decode. You see that happening, you want to go to CW and sideband is usually the best thing to do. If you're on ON4 KST chat, you may actually announce that you're going to CW and try that. The other thing is contests. There are digital contests, and FT8 is very popular. But for me, I find it extremely slow. Mind you, I am primarily an HF contester, so I like speed. I like things to go very, very quickly. FT8, to me, for a contest, is like watching paint dry. I mean, it works great for DXing, but for contest, I don't really like it. But on the other hand, if you really want to be in a contest, sometimes if the station is only on FT8, that's the only way you're going to work them, so you got to do it. FT4 is actually a lot better, and you'll see a lot of contest activity now occurring on 50.318 on the FT4 window on 6 meters. And I've actually tried that, and I find the QSO rate there to actually be quite a bit better. You give up a few decibels in signal to noise, but you can move much more quickly. You can also do things like connect your WSGTX software for digital modes to N1MM Logger Plus and other software, and that can be very useful for contesting as well, getting everything integrated. Sometimes a little bit complicated, but it works really well. And that's the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. This final slide is giving you a few links to some of the resources I pointed to here. Obviously, you're not going to really read those or write them down as part of this presentation, but if you send me an email to my call sign here on the final slide, v3vn@rac.ca, I'd be happy to send you a copy of the slide. And that's the end of the presentation. I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope I see you on 6 meters. Thanks very much in 73.